Hi, this is Jim Clemmer, and we are ready to roll. We have over 400 sites from about 24 different countries that are registered today for this complimentary webinar. I hope you get more than your money's worth as we take a look at what are some of the shifts we need to make in leadership. I'm going to start, first of all, with thought from Warren Bennis. Now, actually, before I even get into this, years ago I was in a meeting with a group of my colleagues, and I caught myself saying, well, once we get through this crazy period and things settle down again, and then I caught myself, realized what I just said, and said to my colleagues, you know, it feels like I've been saying that an awful lot lately. Maybe you catch yourself saying something like that as well. Once we get this new structure in place, or the system is installed, or the position is filled, or whatever the case may be, and things settle down. Well, of course, things don't settle down. The world is shifting ever faster, and leadership needs to shift ever faster. So around about that time, or shortly after that time, I came across this comment from Warren Bennis, who's long been one of my favorite authors, researchers, writers. He said some very nice things about one of my previous books, The Leader's Digest, so clearly the man was brilliant. I quote him even more. But here's what he said. He said, I can't recall a period of time that was as volatile, complex, ambiguous, and tumultuous. And he quotes one executive as saying, if you're not confused, maybe you don't know what's going on. I bet there's a few people here on this webinar that know what's going on. Jean Kerr, American playwright, said something similar years ago when she said, if you can keep your head when everybody else around you is losing theirs, it's just possible you haven't grasped the situation. One of the possibilities. So the world's shifting. Change is happening ever faster, speeding up. I think there's lots of evidence of that. And we need to shift our approaches in our organizations and in our own personal approaches. So here's what we're going to cover over the next while. Drink from a fire hose. In these webinars, we always tend to go broader rather than deeper in one area. So we're going to look at perspectives that need to shift, which is a bit of a ground point or foundation point for a lot of the leadership work that we do. Then we'll talk about balance and the high performance balancing or shifting for many organizations, many leaders that needs to take place. We'll look at 7 key elements or 7 areas for some upshifting. And I hope from that section you'll take away perhaps 1 or 2 areas that you might want to strengthen further. We'll then finish with a look at a big shift that's taking place in leadership development these days. Over the last decade, 15 years, it's been a major shift towards building strengths because it's now become very clear, and I'll show you some of the evidence, that fixing weaknesses demotivates most people when they need to do that and actually weakens improvement. So we'll take a look at that. All right, so let's jump right in. Let's shift into the fast lane here and start to take sips from that fire hose. So starting first of all with shifting perspectives. One of the very beginning points for any of our discussions around leadership and almost any of my work, if you have read some of my books or get my blogs on a regular basis, is you've probably seen variations of this basic theme, that leadership is what we do, our behaviors, not who we are or the role that we're in. So we're going to be focusing and using that theme as leadership involving a number of things. Here's just a few of them: how we influence, how we connect, how we deal with change and the shifts around us, and how we deliver results. So let's take a quick look at another beginning point. As we look at perhaps storms on the horizon or challenges ahead, we can, and changes that are coming at us, sometimes they're welcome, sometimes maybe they're not so welcome. We can basically say that if the rate of external change, the shifting that's happening all around us, exceeds our rate of internal change, it's a pretty good bet we're going to eventually be changed. The storm or the change is not likely to shift for us, so we have a basic decision to make. And so one of the key questions, often in workshops, retreats, we'll spend some time talking about what happens if we don't shift at that rate of change. What are the consequences, potential consequences for us in being changed? And that then starts to open us up to the whole discussion around resilience. Because a lot of change, most of us can deal with positive change pretty easily. When good things happen to us, when our life shifts in a positive way, that's pretty easy to deal with. It's much more difficult when things shift in a very negative way, a very difficult way. And how we deal with failure when things don't go as planned. Do we see it as a temporary setback or something that's much more permanent than that? Is it an experience that we're going through, or is it really defining who we are? Is it something we can learn from, or do we get crushed by it? Can we be traumatized or depressed, or grow and develop? There's actually a field of study emerging around post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic stress. So we start to look at this, and this is sometimes called the trap of the 3 Ps, where we make things permanent, pervasive, and personal. Or we end up peeing ourselves, which our kids would warn you is a dad joke. Our youngest daughter, Vanessa, all of our kids are now married, and we actually have some grandkids coming into the world, so maybe I'm going to have some granddad jokes now. Vanessa would kick her husband, Andy, under the table for laughing at any of my dad jokes. So a few of them may slip in here. But this becomes a very, very important focus for us, is how do we deal with inevitable setbacks that life hands us? The Japanese have this little Dharma doll, which is a good luck charm. And it has this rounded bottom, weighted rounded bottom. And if you push it over, it bounces right back up. And it's a symbol of perseverance and good luck. It's often given out on New Year's. And you notice the 2 rounded eyes are blank. So often the tradition is to paint one in as you are focusing on a goal, perhaps for the year, a bit like a New Year's resolution. And then when you reach that goal, you paint in the other eye. They also have a saying that success comes from falling down 7 times, standing up 8. And that starts to become a very key element of resilience. One of the poster men for resilience, the legacy that Nelson Mandela left behind is extensive, Nobel Prize winning and many other legacies. But one of the things he said in his late years is he said he didn't want to be judged by his successes. He wanted to be judged by how many times he fell down and got back up. So how do we deal with challenges and difficulties in our organizations, in our teams, in our life? How do we deal with those? A major study was done by this group, the International Committee for Study of Victimization, of large groups of people, thousands of people who had all experienced the same traumatic events, whether it was drastic health diagnosis like cancer, prisoners of war, such as there are a number of Holocaust survivors in this study, various victims of mass destruction, natural disasters like tsunamis and hurricanes and so on. And they were contacted 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes even longer after the event. And it was identified through the survey and some of the interviews that were done that these people, all having experienced the same event, fell roughly into 3 camps or groups. A bit of the bell curve here. About 15 or 20% of them were basically saying, this has made me stronger, better, I appreciate life more, I never want to ever go through it again or wish it on anybody else, but it really was a life-altering or a positive, ultimately, event for me. A larger group, more of the 2/3 in the middle, were wavering back and forth day to day. Depending on the day, they were looking forward or they were looking backward and maybe struggling some days and moving forward other days. Another group, another 15 or 20% at the tail end, were in this opposite camp. They were the ones that were bitter, angry, frustrated, basically saying, well, you'd feel this way too if it happened to you. But of course, the key thing is that everybody experienced the same thing. So the reality of the situation was all the same, but the perspectives and how the situations were framed were all very different. Years ago, I ran into somebody at our local plaza that I hadn't seen for a while. When I ran into him, I kind of remembered why I hadn't seen him for a while. I said, "Hey, Phil, how's it going?" He said, "Same crap, different day." Well, how do you argue with that? Phil was one of those guys walking around putting his crap glasses on, looking at all that's wrong, all that's negative, as if maybe there's some kind of prize for that. He proudly piled up the crap and wanted me to wallow in it with him. Actually, a psychologist friend of mine calls it rectal optimitis, just taking a look at the really bad, crappy things in life. Well, of course, it happens. Crap happens. Our choice is whether to stand in it or not. And sometimes the challenge is to see the possibilities. So we played around a bit in my more recent book, Growing at the Speed of Change, with this acronym, and said, well, maybe one way we can look at crap classes, is that we can't readily absorb positivity. And there's actually quite a large and growing body of research now out of the field of positive psychology that's showing that how we frame and look at things makes a world of difference for ourselves, for others, for organizations or teams. So Martin Seligman, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, is considered to be the real founder of this whole movement. He started when he started writing about this in the early 90s, but in the late 90s, he was head of the American Psychological Association, and he had been spending years looking at pessimism and optimism. And at the negative end of the scale, the pessimistic end of the scale, he had specialized in treating depression and dealing with that end of the scale. But he was now looking at how can we frame things in a much more positive way on the optimistic end of the scale. Now, these are not his terms. These are my own look at what are the key elements defining pessimism and optimism, and where are we anchoring our own range of reality, and where are we anchoring our cultures, our teams? Are we anchoring it in fear, inspiration, catching people doing things wrong, focusing on what's wrong, seeing the worst in people? My favorite story of that is a little girl riding the car with her mother one day, and she says to her mother, "Mommy, where are all the stupid jerks and idiots today?" Mother says, "Well, they only come out when your father's driving." It's funny how that works, isn't it? Funny how some people see the worst, bring out the worst, or the best in others. So it all depends on how we look at things and how we make a choice, moment to moment. Now, of course, we can go up and down through these three choices many times throughout the course of a day. But how do we look at things? How do we frame things? Are we using the lens? So you think about a movie director uses the lens of the camera to focus our attention and to frame our attention. So we can focus either on the middle part of this chart, where we're following along, wait and see what happens, hope this goes somewhere positive, not sure, but I'm going to be hopeful and maybe give it the benefit of the doubt, or, oh yeah, sure, I'll bet this is going to head off in a negative direction, and we start to slide down to the lower end of this chart. So let's look at the two extremes. At the top end, we're climbing the stairs of leadership. We're stepping up to leadership. At the negative end, we're sliding down into the swamp of wallowing. We're maybe up Shift Creek without a paddle. We're just not seeing the possibilities. We're perhaps spending way too much time in Pity City, riding the bitter bus down Helpless Highway, through Frown Town, past Pessimism Place, Dead End Drive, all the way into Pity City, where there's no hope, there's no way, they'll never go for it, forget about it, why even bother? We tried that once, there's no way. Well, a few dad jokes did slip in there. So the key thing starts to become recognizing where we're at. So one of the first steps in all of this is, as individuals or in our teams, to step back and say, what does this look like? What does it look like when we're leading, when we're optimistic, when we're positive, when we're looking forward, when we're making things happen? What does that look like for us here or for me in my life? What does it look like when we're stepping back? And when are the times when we might step back a little bit and wait and see and not jump out ahead of things? And what are the dangers of wallowing. And what does that look like? And how do we do that? And what are perhaps times even when we may need to do a bit of that? A little venting, a little letting go of some frustration, perhaps a bit of grieving that needs to happen. So each of these positions, we can go up and down and throughout a day, but the more conscious we are of where we are, the more we can shift that perspective. And the more we know, of course, we want to make ourselves effective, but how to make other people effective is to start by making ourselves effective. So knowing where we are, how we can get ourselves into leading mode, and what we can do to help others spend more time in leading mode. Now, in our workshops, retreats, we spend some time talking this through. In this webinar, the next while, we'll start to look at what are some of those strategies that can do both of those things for us, some of the shifts we need to make. So, shifting perspective. I wrap that up with saying, as we took a quick look through this, you might find yourself stepping back a little bit, looking at the glasses you're using, and perhaps identifying a bit with Daniel Boone. He once said he was never lost, but he was bewildered once for 3 days. So we might say, well, I can't say I'm totally lost. I don't always have those crap glasses on, but occasionally I might be putting them on. So how do we make some of these shifts then? Do we have the right kind of balance? That starts to become one of the key questions. And so as we start to look at the issue of balance, we're going to start to talk about the so-called soft skills area. And I put quotation marks around soft skills because they are really hard. And we're going to look at why we get so unbalanced in this area. Many studies have been done. This is one that was reported on a couple of years ago, major international study. You can see the size of it, 600 respondents, 500 organizations, almost 7,000 CEOs and senior executives. Also a review of 900 books and articles. It really was a major study. And what this and many other studies have shown is that attempts to shift organizations, shift cultures, shift and bring in changes into many teams and organizations has a pretty high failure rate. It turns out that 70% of those efforts, consistently that's been reported for decades now, tend to fail or fall way short of what they're looking for. And there's a tendency to blame, well, we don't have enough people, enough money, we don't have enough time, we haven't, it's external things that are doing this to us. But as these researchers found, shifting employee attitudes and management behavior was the key element in all of this. And they conclude with saying it really is that soft stuff that's often overlooked that's so absolutely vital. So we've come to realize and know in a lot of our work around organization culture that the soft elements of leadership or culture are the key elements that either boost change efforts or block them. So here's a list of typical kinds of change efforts. You might take a look at the list and check all that apply here and see, I'm sure one or two of these are fairly prominent for your organization or perhaps for your team. So culture then becomes the key element that either boosts or blocks those. And that boils back down then to this key statement that where a culture comes from is many places, but predominantly it's the leadership team that's leading that culture, whether it's a division, department, region, or an entire organization. The culture, the local culture or the more universal culture is what makes the huge difference here. And so where does that come from? Well, we take a look at three key elements here that have to do certainly with culture, also have to do with individual behaviors for every one of us. So we can take this to the job level, the team level, or the organization level. And we can say there are three main components to be balanced. There is our technical expertise, and these days a lot of the use of technology and technical expertise are often intertwined. How we've organized ourselves, our day perhaps, our systems, our processes, the way we get work done, the structure that we have for the organization are key elements as well. And then we put deliberately at the base of this triangle the whole people component, the leadership component, the key groups of people being those we serve, call them customers, taxpayers, patients, whatever organization you may be in, and those doing the serving, those who are on the front lines who are making all of this happen. And so it's the balancing then of the hands, the head, and the heart. That's the tricky, very difficult balance. And when you look through the vast amount and growing amount of literature and research on organization effectiveness, on leadership effectiveness, you continually see variations of these sorts of themes. And in fact, what we'll see sometimes even more clearly is this balancing of the head, planning, analysis, controls, good thinking, intellectual abilities, things like Lean, Six Sigma kinds of systems that are being used these days for efficiency, with the so-called soft stuff. So the management side is the hard side of this equation. Leadership is the soft side of this equation. Or another way of looking at it is management has a lot to do with IQ, whereas leadership has a lot to do with EQ, or emotional intelligence. And of course, there's been over the last 20 years now a massive body of research showing the power of emotional intelligence, that those leaders who are fairly equal in IQ, what distinguishes by 2 or 3 times more effective leaders and more effective individuals, even Nobel Prize-winning scientists, are things like emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize and control our own emotions and influence the emotions of others. Well, another way we can look at this is boss versus leader. So in a workshop, we'll spend a bit of time talking about, well, what does a boss look like? What are the characteristics of a boss? Behaviors of a boss. Well, I love this little graphic here. That oftentimes the outcome of boss behavior is putting people down, knocking self-esteem or respect perhaps, and boss behaviors tend to often have lingering negative effects. Whereas leader behaviors, as we're going to see in the next section, are behaviors that uplift, that inspire, that draw people forward and make people want to and feel drawn to and seeing opportunities rather than needing to. Whereas characteristics of a boss might be to be a snoopervisor, a leader will bring forth the good in others. And so let's take a look at a bit of the research. We've been working for the last 5 years now with Zenger-Folkman. I'll be talking a bit more about their research a little later. And this chart is showing 360 data that comes from the database is now almost 1 million assessments of nearly 100,000 leaders. And we can see here very clearly the difference in, when you look over at the left side, the percentage of employees that are thinking about quitting is pretty high when there's very poor leadership. So the bottom axis are assessments by roughly 10, 12 on average people, direct reports, peers, others who may be inside or outside the organization, and the manager. Whereas the left axis is purely direct reports who are thinking about quitting. And we see this big difference between outstanding leaders or extraordinary leaders at the 90th percentile and those at the very worst. But even there's a big difference between the 50th percentile and the 90th percentile. Well, behind this we have an iceberg to illustrate that this is the tip of the iceberg. These are people who quit and leave, well, we know that this isn't quite saying that. This chart is saying that those who are thinking about quitting, and half of the people who think about quitting do leave within 18 months, we know. The bigger part of the problem here is people who quit and stay. On-the-job retirement, major problem, engagement issues in many organizations today. And when you take a look at, well, how do we get people more engaged, it turns out that about 70%, and there's a real convergence of research on this point, that somewhere around 60 to 70% of the variable that most determines how engaged a frontline employee is his or her immediate boss. So here we see an example where someone who is rated by everybody as being very poor leader, their level of direct report engagement is very low. Where leaders are reported as being good leaders, not terrific, but okay, we see the engagement levels climb. And of course, we see the other end of the spectrum when leaders are rated as being highly effective. So a number of studies. Safety shows here, for example, 3.5 times safer workplace for an extraordinary leader, an outstanding leader, than for a very poor leader. But even again, look at the difference between good in the middle at 50th percentile and great. We see much higher levels of safety. Or extra effort, people willing to go the extra mile, which is one of the questions in our 360 assessment. And these are people who have scored themselves a 5 out of 5 in willing to go the extra mile. We see the bottom third of leaders have much lower levels of people who are willing to go the extra mile. The middle gets a little better. Now let's take a look at extraordinary. High leadership has much higher levels of people willing to go the extra mile. So as we wrap up this brief discussion, and we come back to the question here at the outset, how's our balance? So one of the exercises we'll do with this chart, and I invite you to think about this, you may even want to quickly sketch down the chart and do the exercise, is to think about how much of my time do I spend in technical, management, and leadership areas, and how much of my time should I be spending? And when you go through the exercise, inevitably what comes out is the vast majority of people doing this are saying, I need to spend a lot more time in leadership. And so then we talk about, well, why aren't you spending as much time leading as you'd like to? And some leaders are tempted to start to say, well, it's because of them, and they point to their boss or to others, or my email inbox, or all the demands on my time. But we know just from those charts we just saw, for example, those are many times those leaders are all in the same organization, facing the same sets of circumstances, but they're doing things very differently. So if we look in the mirror and we look at what can we control to increase our leadership time, there are actually quite a number of factors we can control. And let's look at a few of those briefly. So we'll go on here to look at the 7 key factors, or what I tend to think of as 7 timeless leadership principles that can help us shift from good management, and we see examples there, and we've talked through some of those examples, to great leadership. How we inspire, how we coach, how we guide, how we build strengths, how we foster highly effective cultures. There are a number of key elements that show up there. So a couple of years back, I wrote a book called Growing the Distance, which had as its central model the leadership wheel that I'm about to just give you a quick overview of. And then a few years later, a companion book, The Leader's Digest, took that same wheel and looked at focusing on leading others. So I'm going to go flip back and forth a little bit between these two perspectives, between leading ourselves and leading others. So the leadership wheel has as its hub this thing we call focus and context. And I'll be explaining what that is momentarily. And then around that are 6 other principles that I've tried to use relatively generic terms for. Of course, there's lots of different labels as you could put on these principles, but they keep showing up time and again in different forms as being critical to effective leadership. So let's start with the hub, the center of all of this. There are really 3 key questions here that form this hub. Simplest I ever heard this boiled down years ago was someone who had an answering machine who said, hi, I'm not in right now. This is not an answering machine. This is a questioning machine. And the 2 most important questions in life are, who are you and what do you want? Well, our 3 questions are, where are you going? So have you got a clear picture, a clear image of your preferred future for yourself, your team, your organization? Lots of evidence showing imagery, visualization is powerful magnet. What do we believe in? So what are our values, principles, aspirations that can be called different things? But what is it that anchors how we behave to each other or how I live my life? And then third, or firstly, these aren't in any order, what is the purpose of our existence? Pretty deep question. Or why do we exist as a team or as an organization? That it connects to the heart, not the head. We might say on the head side, well, we exist to produce profits or to meet our objectives or our goals or produce services or whatever it may be. On the heart side, we're going deeper than that. We exist to make a difference, to change something in a very positive way. So when we're doing this kind of work, we'll often, for example, come back and you start to see this theme throughout a lot of my work of management and leadership. We'll start to contrast what happens on the goal or the management side of the equation. We need all of that. We need business cases. We need to focus on targets and objectives and solve problems and use linear step-by-step methods like lean methods, for example. We also need vision. We need those sky hooks that are out there, those leaps of faith, or that sense of where we want to move toward that we may not be entirely sure how we're going to get there, but we know that's where we want to be. And we hook ourselves to that and build that visioning. There's a big difference between a vision statement, for example, and visioning. And so as we look as well at values, most organizations these days, I was with a group yesterday from a variety of organizations and asked how many of you had a set of core values. Every hand went up. It's a very common thing, but the snicker factor is pretty high in many organizations around those values. So are those values being used in key people decisions? That really shows to what extent the values are just poster values on a bumper sticker or truly lived values. All right, well, let's carry on to next principle, which I call taking responsibility for the choices that we make. And it really gets to the heart of that statement about leadership being an action, not a position, that everybody can be a leader, regardless of role or position. That it really, if it is to be, it's up to me. Now, that doesn't mean we don't delegate, and we don't involve others, but it's about taking initiative and moving things forward. And so in organizations particularly, or in our own lives, a variation of this kind of exercise can be very useful, where we step back and we look at what are the things that we directly control, what are the things over which we have influence, from high to very low levels of influence, and what are the things over which we have no control whatsoever. Well, that end of the no control spectrum, one of the things we need to do is to learn how to let go of some of that stuff. The poet Longfellow said, I find the best thing to do when it's raining is let it rain, to awfulize it, to have a pity party in Pity City, to get ourselves all angry and twisted and all out of shape over something we really can't change is very destructive. So in our teams and organizations, we need to focus on what are the things we can directly control or the things that we can influence. And as we talk through this and look at this, we need to look at if we're going to go from groaning about some of these things to growing and being stronger leaders, we need to recognize the victim speak that exists in many, many organizations. We'll never do it. They'll never go for it. The other departments or other groups, there's a large number of these sorts of victim speak things that take place. So how might we as leaders or our team be modeling or reinforcing that? I find that a lot of leaders and leadership teams don't recognize the degree to which they're reinforcing some of that victimitis, which I think is one of the deadly diseases in our society today, the victimitis virus. And how can we then build a organization of leaderful navigators to make all of this happen? Well, I'll wrap up with a Chinese proverb here with this principle. Waiting for a roast duck to fly into your mouth is going to take a very long time. So let's make sure we step up and take responsibility and make it happen. Authenticity. Well, if you can fake this one, you can really be a leader. Well, obviously not. It's not like Groucho Marx who said, I've got values, and if you don't like those values, I've got others. We all recognize that's not leadership. And that leadership is, we hear the term, walk the talk, lead by example, or having our behavior, the most believable communication is our behavior, more so than necessarily our talk. We use this continuum sometimes to talk about if we're trying to bring about change or shift perspectives or shift behaviors in organizations. We often can say, well, sure, they've got my permission. Go ahead and get trained or go off and implement that change program. I'll even support it a little more actively, give it some real strong lip service, perhaps turn up the rhetoric and really get passionate about how you need to be more effective. You need to work together as a team. You need to, well, of course, we're at a critical juncture here. If we just continue more of that, more talk, more yada, 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 blah, 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 people's BS detectors today are ever more sensitive. They can just pick that up pretty quickly. Or when it truly is action and follow through. And so that's what a big part of what this principle is about, is that looking at how our behaviors overshadow what we're saying, either in a positive or in a negative way. And that then also takes us into a discussion of moose on the table. So here's a group of people sitting in a meeting, and there's this great big moose. Or you could put an elephant or a kangaroo or a camel. We've used various creatures around the world in the middle of the table. And it's dropping off moose pies off of one end of the table. It's eating off the other end of the table. It's getting in the way. People are looking around its legs. Somebody needs to finally stop and say, whoa, time out here. Let's get rid of this stupid moose. We could be much more productive if we got rid of that. And so I played with that idea in one of my books, Moose on the Table. It was one of my only works of fiction, where I had this manager wrestling with moose problems, and that there were lots of moose tracks showing up everywhere. So finding ways to identify the moose, finding ways to address the moose, get those discussions out, having what we call courageous conversations is absolutely vital part of building authentic workplaces, transparent, open workplaces, strong teams, and of course, authentic leadership for ourselves. So what is it we're doing to reduce the moose? Because this is one of those situations where you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. There really is no middle ground. If you're not helping to bring out these issues and have them discussed, then you're enabling the moose to continue. Okay, so let's take a look at passion and commitment. Well, we'll all eventually die, of course. The real tragedy is failing to fully live. Some people are having near-life experiences. I asked a manager one time, well, how many people work here? And he said, about half. And as we were doing some assessment work in the organization, it became clear that maybe he was even a little on the optimistic side. So engaging and inspiring and connecting others is an absolutely critical element of leadership. And as we've been showing throughout, and we go back to the so-called soft stuff, leadership is about inspiring and emotions and evoking emotions and care and passion and love in others. So am I a carrier? Is the first question. Does that describe me as a person, as a leader? Do I let my face know about it? Is it clear to others that I feel that way? Am I impassioning others? Because if I'm not, then I might be a strong manager, but it really is difficult to lead effectively or to build that sense of internal commitment that Chris Argyris from Harvard talks about here, where he talks about building that is largely fostering it from within through participation, through empowerment, through drawing it out of others, and things like stretch targets and so on. So how am I doing at passion and commitment? Spirit and meaning becomes another principle that we can leverage further. Now, we don't necessarily have to be great at all of these things, but it's finding leverage points that we can really work through and work on. And so in this area, when we're dealing with change and helping others to shift change, to shift whatever the shift may be, there's a pies model that's sometimes helpful to look at this. So is the level of commitment to change political? Just people are doing it because they want to be seen to be doing it, and it's a very superficial level of getting with the program. The next level is where there's a strong business case. Lots of PowerPoint slides. Here's the case for the change. Well, that's management, and that's important. But if we're going to go deeper to leadership, we need to touch emotion. We need to foster and make emotional connections that can ideally take us, excuse me, even deeper to a sense of spirit or connection. The great painter Renoir in the last years painted with severe arthritis with brushes strapped to his wrists. And he was quoted as saying, "The pain is momentary, but the art will last." So are we fostering that kind of connection? Are we looking at building a strong way of being throughout our organizations or teams? Well, growing and developing. To what extent are we developing others, growing others? I love the analogy of the fish tank factor, that you can take a small goldfish, keep it in a little bowl, it'll always stay small, put it in a much larger tank, and that fish gets bigger. The little bowl is management, seeing people as they are. Why would we put them in a larger tank? This is all they're capable of. Whereas leadership is growing people into what they could be. And so what does that look like? Well, that means going from command to coaching, from being the one solving the problems and perhaps taking a lot of monkeys on your own back, to monkey management, helping others to solve problems and control their own monkeys, directing and controlling, to teaching and engaging, seeing people as they could be, empowering to partnering. Empowering can sometimes has a paternalistic piece to it. Operating and focusing operations to improving, pushing, which is an element of what management often is, to drawing forth or pulling others. Heroic management, saving the day, riding into town, solving the problem, versus facilitating and coordinating discussions so that we can move away from quick fixes to getting to deeper systemic causes. Well, our last area then is really where a lot of this comes together, growing or mobilizing and energizing. I saw once a great Farkas cartoon. He said there was a leader at the head of the table pounding on the table saying, "We need to improve engagement levels around here. Any of you boneheads have a good idea?" It was like the car mechanic who said, "I couldn't fix your brakes, so I made your horn louder." For some managers, it's all about pushing harder, motivating people, which of course is a great myth. We really can't motivate anybody. I love the way Dave Sirota put it based on his research depth on this whole thing about motivating the workforce. He thinks it's a silly question to try to figure out how to motivate anybody. The better question is, how do you keep management from destroying motivation? We don't need a lot of gimmicks and trying to find hot buttons to do that. But we need, for example, something like servant leadership. Here's an example of where we look at things are holding us back. There are resistors. There are barriers in the way. There are walls that are stopping us from being as effective or as energized or inspired. And then there are drivers that we can try to use. Compensation might be an example, goals, objectives, etc. And so the question becomes, well, how do we allow more of those natural drivers to show through by removing the resistors? Here's the way, Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, is saying, well, what's in the way is the way. So again, we come back to what can we control, what can we influence, and what we have no control over, and let's focus on the things that we can do something about. Here's how one leader put it in an interview I did a while back when I was interviewing some of the top leaders in the organization to get a better sense of what made them so effective. And this leader gave this philosophy that a lot of the people that work here have a passion and a purpose for the work that they do. So my role is to facilitate their desire to keep doing that good work and to get rid of the obstacles in their path. And that, of course, is a great definition of servant leadership. Another piece in this area, which covers quite a bit of territory, but is the difference between information and communication. So if I could see your hands raising, I would ask the question as I do in groups. How many of you want more communication in your organization? Just what everybody's hand goes up. Then I ask, how many would like more emails? I don't usually get too many hands going up. Yet, what happens when somebody says we need more communication around here? Oftentimes managers send more emails, CC more people. Well, what we're really looking at is the difference between information and communication. Most people are communication starved in an information overloaded world. What is it that is important? What is it that connects me, inspires me, engages me? How can I be part of the conversation and make this two-way communication, which of course really is all communication really is two-way, but lots of times we're subjected to information dumps that are called communication that really aren't communication at all. So that's a very quick run through, that is a drink from the fire hose, of some of the key elements, what I call timeless leadership principles that keep showing up time and again. And as I said a few minutes ago, we don't need to be good at all of these things. This is not about let's be perfect or let's be outstanding at everything. First step is there something that's really holding us back, something that's really getting in the way? We would call a fatal flaw. And then the next step is, can we leverage a couple of key areas to as strengths to move us forward? And so in our last few minutes, I'm going to talk a bit more about the shift that's taking towards strength building and why it's so much more effective than the very deeply ingrained traditional approach that we've been using for decades now, which is proving to just not be effective. If we go back to some of the early thinking on this, Peter Drucker, actually in the 60s, wrote a little book called The Effective Executive. It's one of the first books in management I ever read many years ago when I was in the management role. In fact, I reread it about a year ago, and it's still as irrelevant as ever. And he devoted an entire chapter in that book to leveraging and building on strengths. And here's some of what he said. He said, we can't build performance on weaknesses. We can only build on strengths. He called it foolish and irresponsible to focus on weaknesses, a misuse of human resources, because all a weakness really is a limitation. Well, it's taken a good couple of decades for research to catch up to Drucker's skyhook out there and his intuition about leadership. And in fact, I first came familiar with a lot of this work through Martin Seligman. I mentioned positive psychology back at the beginning of the presentation. This is one of his books that was considered to be one of the founding books of the positive psychology movement. And here he talks about how correcting weaknesses is much less effective and produces much less happiness or flourishing, the name of one of his more recent books, than focusing on using our strengths. So about 5 years ago, I'd been staying in touch with Jack Zenger. He and I were co-founders of our own companies that worked together in the 80s and 90s. His was Zenger Miller out of California. Mine was the Achieve Group here in Canada. And so Jack and I had stayed in touch, but about 5 years ago, I reconnected with him, and he had connected with Joe Folkman back around the early 2000s. And Joe, as a psychometrician, brings hard measurements to these soft areas of leadership and culture and effectiveness, and did his PhD thesis in 360 assessments. And so when I saw the work that Jack and Joe were doing, I became quite excited because finally here were some tools, some concrete tools for taking this philosophy of strength building to implementation, to practical implementation. So here's what they did in their original work. So this is going back to around 2000, 2002. They spent 2 years through that period of looking at the impact of leadership on performance and on key behaviors. At that time, they had a database of roughly 200,000 360 assessments done on about 20,000 leaders. The database today is about 5 times that now, has grown substantially. And they were contrasting the lowest, worst performing leaders to the best performing leaders. And we saw some of that data earlier. It could show that leadership effectiveness could be measured and correlated to things like we saw earlier, employee engagement, going the extra mile, commitment levels, etc. But only if you're measuring the right things. Turns out that of the dozens of different competencies that are around, there's a smaller number, only about 16, that correlate in that fashion. There are lots of competencies that don't, that have no connection. Charisma, time management, organizational skills, managerial courage. There's a long list of things that show up in competency models that don't correlate. The other thing that they found was that building existing strengths was one of the key ways to go from good leadership to great leadership, or good management to great leadership. If you want more information on this, there's tons of it on our website. We can also send you some further links. But if you want to look deeper at some of the original work, that was the book that they produced in 2002 and was then revised and expanded a number of years later. And then a few years ago, they came out with How to Be Exceptional, which is a little more of an executive summary of this work and a further updating it. And they also published an article in Harvard Business Review on this work called Making Yourself Indispensable. So those are a few places that you can go if you want to get a little more background, a little more research here. So what does it all mean? Well, what we've come to realize is that performance improvement, let's say take performance appraisals as an example. How much time is spent in a performance appraisal figuring out how to help the individual leverage strengths? Very little. How much time is spent in a performance appraisal building up an improvement plan that's focused on weaknesses? Most of the time. In fact, most of us equate our improvement plans with closing gaps, fixing weaknesses. And yet, we know that that is not effective. And we know, in fact, that the only time we really should be doing something like that is when there is a fatal flaw. If there is something that is really critical and standing out, then that needs to be addressed. But our research shows now that only about 20–25% of the time is that the case. So that means 3/4 of the time, there isn't a fatal flaw. When there is a fatal flaw, leadership effectiveness is really low. It drags everything else down with it. But most people feedback looks a little more like this, where things tend to hover around the middle, around average. And so you look at that sort of feedback, and many of you who have had experience with 360 assessments, you know that what you tend to do, back to the improvement plan, just like a performance appraisal time, you look at this and say, okay, well, I got to fix my weaknesses in order to get better. And yet, what's the impact of focusing on, so let's say in this example, those lower bars were raised up equivalent to where the higher bars are. Would that change the overall picture? Not really, not very much. And so what our research shows is that you don't have to be outstanding at everything to leverage leadership, to be an outstanding leader. In fact, what it shows is that if a leader is assessed with no fatal flaws and no profound strengths, kind of in the middle, like we just saw, there's where they stand. In the overall assessment in the database of 100,000 leaders that have been assessed, they're around just barely in the bottom third or close to the bottom third. However, if they take just one of the leadership areas and leverage it, take it to the 90th percentile, here's the impact. Almost doubles the perceived effectiveness of that person. Here's what 2 looks like, 3, 4, and 5. So we can see that 5 leadership areas leveraged to the 90th percentile will, in fact, take a person to extraordinary leadership, which is how we define 90th percentile, how we define that. So it's not the absence of weaknesses that defines outstanding leaders. It's the presence of a few profound strengths. And you can test that for yourself by thinking of outstanding leaders you know. What stood out? Well, a couple of key things really stood out that overshadowed their weaker areas, because they probably weren't perfect human beings. I highly doubt they were perfect human beings. They had weaknesses, but the strengths overshadowed those. Well, we have pre-post data from a series of 360s that a number of organizations have done over the years, in the 15 years or so since this work has been underway with Zenger-Folkman. And we certainly see this in the 5 years or so at the Clemmer Group. We've been working with this as well, is that when leaders focus on fixing weaknesses, the good news is, as in, say, a traditional 360 assessment, they see improvement. Now, this is being assessed by everybody else. This is not self-assessment of the leader. When they focus on building strengths, there's actually 2 to 3 times more improvement that is shown. Well, why is that? Well, you start to look at, we've surveyed leaders who've shown these kinds of outcomes in their 360s, and what we hear them saying is that when they focus on strengths, they spend more time on their plan, they are much more confident about improvement, they focus more specifically on key issues, they put real time and effort into it, they involve more people, and so forth. So focusing on focusing on strengths is a key element to making all of this happen. And how do we do that? Well, one of the things that we do is take the situation of the individual, take their strengths, their need for the organization or the role that they're in, and the organization's need for that role, and what they're passionate about. And those 3 together form a sweet spot that allows leaders to leverage their effectiveness to a much higher degree than focusing on weaknesses. Okay, well, we have covered a lot of ground. That fire hose has been spraying now for some time. Hopefully you're getting some useful sips here as we go along. So let's wrap up with, where do we go from here? How do we put foundations under some of the sort of aspirations or loftier pictures that we've painted? Well, a couple of things that I'll mention here, if you want to go further with this, is that we do have in Mississauga, about 10 minutes from the Toronto airport, a workshop. I'm running the Extraordinary Leader Workshop on June 1st, which involves the Strengths-Based 360 assessment that I touched on very briefly here. So it's using that whole process. And then the next day, as an optional second day, you can do either one of these days independently or together, is the Extraordinary Coach, which is a very powerful process using a 4-step framework that has a deep amount of research and lots of practical applications behind it. So that's one opportunity to take things further. Another opportunity is I am doing an expanded version of today's webinar. So I've, in a short period of time here, in less than an hour, I've walked you through a number of areas. Well, we're going to spend a lot more time on that, a whole day, in partnership with Conestoga College in Kitchener. Those of you not familiar with where Kitchener, Ontario is, which is where I'm located, center of the universe. You may have known that, may not have known that. Anyway, it's about 45 minutes west of the Toronto airport. And so you're certainly welcome to join us for that session. It is a public or an open session. So we will be following through with further information on everything that we've covered here today, and links to more material and areas, links to some of those sessions I've shown you. There's some other webinars that we've done along the areas that I've touched on, such as culture, or going deeper into strength building or coaching, or looking at basic building blocks of leadership effectiveness. So we'll send some of that along to you. There's also a fairly recent webinar that Zenger-Folkman did around performance management and the shift to strength building. We'll also be sending you a survey to get some of your feedback and potential application here, how you want to apply and use some of this. And you see 4 of my more recent books shown there. So we're going to do a draw from the survey responses, and you get a choice of which of those books you'd like to have us send if you end up winning that draw. Well, that's about it, folks. We do try to make sure we have good on-time performance, and our time is up. So hopefully you did get much more than your money's worth here today. Picked up a number of good ideas, I hope, from your sips from that fire hose. And we will be in touch. Look for that survey, look for the follow-through. And of course, if you have further questions or need any further kind of information, please just respond back and we'll get right back to you. Thank you for joining us.